possibly cause another technical problem. For those of you who are here, I'm curious how many of you have at least heard the term degrowth? Almost everybody. Well, fine. There are a lot of misunderstandings out about it. I am speaking very much as an advocate, as a believer in degrowth. As I will explain, I believe it's the only way that we have at least a chance, but certainly not a certainty, of saving ourselves from intolerable climate change, global warming. It presents the possibility of an environmental program that will reverse that change, but it also presents a lot of other things in terms of new ways of thinking about our lives, which I will be getting into. But first, I want to start out by talking about the snail. The snail is the mascot of degrowth. It's borrowed from the slow food movement, which is a movement, almost everybody. Well, fine. There are a lot of misunderstandings out about it. I am speaking very much as an advocate, as a believer in degrowth. As I will explain, I believe it's the only way that we have at least a chance, but certainly not a certainty, of saving ourselves from intolerable climate change, global warming. It presents the possibility of an environmental program that will reverse that change, but it also presents a lot of other things in terms of new ways of thinking about our lives, which I will be getting into. But first, I want to start out by talking about the snail. The snail is the mascot of degrowth. It's borrowed from the slow food movement, which is a movement somewhat popular in Europe, especially in Italy, of people who believe that you should grow your food slowly and prepare your food slowly and eat your food slowly, always in the company of good friends, and the food should be not only delicious, but healthy. And it has been taken over or adopted by the degrowth people because it fits with the idea of degrowth that efficiency, if by efficiency you mean doing more, bigger, faster, is less important than sufficiency, having enough. And so the snail seems to represent the values of degrowth. But there's more. The snail, it turns out, according to Ivan Illich, is a natural degrowther. The snail, instead of growing without end, periodically when its shell reaches a certain size, it sheds the shell and starts over. So, as I say, it represents the values of degrowth in all of these ways. So what is degrowth? How is it? What does it make different? Degrowth is an economy in the service of needs, not profit. It's a planned decrease in the use of materials and energy in wealthy countries while maintaining the standard of living. And the idea is that you can decrease the use of materials and energy and maintain the standard of living in ways in which I will get to, but it is definitely for the wealthy countries. It does not call for degrowth in poor countries. Degrowth is for the northern countries, the wealthy countries, not for the southern countries. They should continue to grow, but until they reach the possibility of having a reasonable standard of living for all of their population, but grow in a different way, grow in a more balanced way than it has been customary heretofore. In the wealthy countries, capitalism requires continuous growth. It exploits what Marx has called the free gifts of nature, the supposed free gifts of nature, to feed perpetual accumulation. Capitalism breeds inequality, exploitation, and environmental degradation. That growth, the accumulation that is pursued by capitalism, is measured by the gross domestic product, the GDP, which is the total monetary value of all goods and services produced in a country in a year. It's a broad measure of overall domestic production, and it functions, or is taken to function, as a comprehensive scorecard of the country's economic health. But it doesn't really measure economic health, because most of the rewards of growth go to the already wealthy. As we can see here, looking at pre-tax income growth in the United States between 1980 and 2014, the bottom half of the population had their income not grow at all. What they call here the middle, which is really the 50th to the 90th percentile, grew by about 100%, more or less doubled. The top 10% grew by 200%, the top 1% a little more, the top 0.1% by maybe 300% income growth, the top 0.01, which is 100th of the population, grew by 400%. 0.001, the top 1,000th of the population, saw their income grow by 600% between 1980 and 2014. So growth in the economy, growth in GDP, which is how it is measured, does not contribute to the standard of living of most of us. So what we see, what has happened to world GDP with capitalism for almost 200 years, and actually for several 100,000 years, almost 2,000 years, and for several 100,000 years before that, world GDP did not grow. Starting around 1800, it takes off. We have a massive growth in GDP, which has led to much greater wealth, not reasonably distributed, but also to a massive increase in the use of energy and materials. And it has not contributed much to the welfare of the population, as we can see if we look at the correlation between life expectancy and GDP per capita. In very poor countries, there's a sharp increase in life expectancy with the growth of GDP. But once you reach a still relatively low point of about $10,000 per capita per year, you find that the relationship simply flattens out. There is no further increase in life expectancy with further increase up until in GDP. Here we see the United States, the richest country in terms of GDP per capita, has essentially the same life expectancy as Cuba, or the other countries which you can no longer see. Health and social problems are not related to average income in rich countries. Here you see Wilkinson and Pickett, the spirit level index of health and social problems on a graph along with GDP per capita. And you can see there's simply no relationship. The United States is the highest in GDP. It's also the highest in health and social problems, but across the whole range of OECD countries, of wealthy countries, there's pretty close to a zero correlation. What does matter is income inequality, income equality. You find that health and social problems rise consistently with increases in inequality. The United States is not only the richest country, it's also the most unequal country, and it has the greatest incidence of health and social problems. Other countries fall along the regression line with showing a very close relationship to social inequality. The greater the inequality, the greater the problems in health and social areas. There are a number of problems with GDP that have to be taken into account when we ask, why doesn't it improve quality of life as you would expect as a country gets richer? Well, why? For one reason, some goods are bad. GDP includes everything that contributes to the cash economy, regardless of what it does for us. There are lots of things there that are actually harmful, like military expenditures, tobacco, academic administrator salaries that do not add much to our quality of life. GDP does not count externalities, which are the things that are produced but not paid for, like pollution in factories. GDP does not count inequality, as we just saw. These three things, from a sociological point of view, can be considered errors of validity. The measure doesn't measure what it's supposed to. But the last one is not a measure of invalidity. It's an actual, it's valid that GDP reflects resource use, but resource use produces more environmental damage. But there's a fetish about GDP, the assumption that growth means things are getting better, and they don't. GDP does not measure social well-being. Here we see the increase in the use of natural resources from 1970 to about 2015. The red line represents the sustainable level of resource use. And this is on a worldwide basis. The world was using resources sustainably up until about 1995. And since then, resource use has continued to increase. The sustainable line hasn't moved up with it. So we are expending resources. And of course, the resource use is greatest in the higher income categories. Here we see the relationship of individual income, family income in the United States to household carbon footprint, and the incomes over $150,000 have the highest. And if we had more precise categories, $150,000 is of course not such a huge income today, but as we went, if we could go further up, we would see continued increase in the use of energy and the production of carbon pollution. This has also led to a major environmental crisis tracked by the International Panel on Climate Change, which in its sixth assessment report from 2 years ago, from a year and a half ago, August of 2021, said that we are on track, the world is on track for a 2% increase, a 2-degree centigrade increase in world temperature, accompanied by a whole lot of disastrous consequences. The economic effects, the environmental effects of economic growth include climate change, ocean acidification. These are things that are already going on. These are not the things that might happen if we continued on the trajectory that we were on, but we have changes in land use, sea level, deforestation, desertification, species extinction, water and air pollution, depletion of stocks. And what this tells us as we see these effects of environmental, the effects of capitalism and through capitalism on resource use and carbon dioxide pollution, we see that we simply cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. So what is the degrowth alternative? The degrowth alternative is to posit an economy in the service of needs, not profit, a move away from production to a vision of the good life and equality and universal provision of social services. Degrowth proposes progressive taxes that would take money away from the wealthy, in particular, a wealth tax. This is something we don't have in the United States, but has been proposed by both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in their presidential campaigns, that people with excessive amounts of wealth, I think for Bernie, the cutoff is about $5 million. If you have more than $5 million, you would be required to pay a small percentage of your wealth, 1 or 2% every year in a tax. We tax wealth on the basis of capital gains. When you sell something, you have to pay a tax on the profit, but we don't tax the wealth that people possess. And these measures would bring about redistribution. But even more important is what is called redistribution, which is how does the taxation system and the various government policies, how can they limit the possibility of getting that rich in the first place? How can we prevent the massive fortunes that have been accumulated? One possibility is a financial transactions tax. Another possibility would be a limit on top salaries, antitrust actions against the capitalist corporations that are increasingly monopolized and build up the fortunes of their principal stockholders, health and safety regulations that would, of course, have other benefits, as well as limiting the profits of corporations. And finally, perhaps the most important thing would be strengthening of unions so that there were countervailing powers between the accumulation of great wealth and the corporations. Structural changes would include universal social services, universal health care. How can we not, after the pandemic, how can we not recognize the need for health care for everybody at no cost to them? Universal education, free higher education becomes increasingly important here. Public transportation, public support for recreation and leisure, guarantee of jobs and housing for whom the market doesn't provide it. This is a guarantee. It doesn't mean that the government would provide jobs and housing for everybody. Doesn't mean we all have to move into public housing, but for those for whom the market doesn't provide, the government should provide. Public control of energy would contribute a lot to limiting the effect of burning energy, burning fossil fuels on the environment. A shorter work week, it's not so obvious, but it's certainly worth thinking about, because if we're going to limit the increase of GDP, we have to limit the increase of production. Does that mean a lot of people will go into unemployment? Well, cutting the work week down to 30 hours would increase the number of jobs available. There are a lot of changes in everyday life that are part of the degrowth program. Reclaiming the commons, neighbor-to-neighbor cooperation, cooperative institutions, credit co-ops, housing co-ops, consumer co-ops, a downshift in consumption. Clearly, even if you're not with filthy rich, many of the people in this room, including myself, could change our consumption patterns without suffering too much in the way of loss of material welfare. Do it yourself. Products should be made, your iPhone should be made so that it can be repaired, so that you don't have to throw it away and get a new one as soon as it goes bad. The right to repair is something for which some people have called for legislation, that corporations have to provide for it. And public services should be managed democratically, so that they serve the needs of the people and not the needs of the corporation that provides them. What are the main objections to degrowth? One objection is that it wouldn't produce enough. Growth is needed, allegedly, to fight inequality. Well, we've seen earlier on that growth doesn't contribute to fighting inequality. Growth can, in fact, accentuate inequality because its rewards go to those that already have. Another objection is that growth is not needed. And I have to spend a little time on this because it involves some technical issues, but there are a number of technological fixes that have been proposed to limit growth, to maintain growth and to limit the environmental effects that supposedly growth can be decoupled from the use of energy and the use of resources. We can use energy and resources more efficiently so that we don't need more of them, we don't use them up, even while economic growth continues. There's a problem, there's a few problems with this proposition. Some scholars point to the evidence of decoupling, but usually that evidence is subject to one of two fallacies. There is what I call the one product fallacy. You can show that there has been a decline in the use of one kind of material, but if that's been overcompensated by the use of a different material, then you haven't achieved degrowth and you haven't lowered the polluting effect of the use of materials. The one country fallacy has to do with showing that in a given country, the use of materials, especially fossil fuels or other carbon generating materials, has declined even though the GDP of that country has grown. This has been true in the United States, in the UK, and in other European countries. But where does it come from? It comes from outsourcing our manufacturing to poor countries, so that the pollution effect of manufacturing processes has its incidence not in the wealthy countries of Europe and the US, but in the poorer countries. And the final reason why decoupling doesn't improve environmental conditions is that is what's called the rebound effect. We can use resources more efficiently and still use more of them. In the United States, we have had fuel economy standards for cars since the 1970s, and they have worked in the sense that fuel economy has improved, that cars do use get more miles per gallon than they have gotten. There's been steady increases in this. But the problem is it hasn't led to any decline in the use of gasoline because we drive more and we drive bigger cars. So we use more gasoline. And I should say, I've sort of skipped over some of the things I meant to say earlier. Renewables. Renewable energy is certainly an important thing and has improved. We are using more and more renewables in terms of solar power, wind power, than we have used in the past. And it has gotten cheaper. So it's promising to use it, but it hasn't led to a significant decline in the use of fossil fuels. It just means we use more energy. And the amount of energy used by the average household with the proliferation of electric devices, electronic devices, as well as home appliances, has meant that the use of energy increases. And if an increasing percentage of this is taken up by renewables, it still doesn't mean we're using fewer fossil fuels. It doesn't mean we're using less energy. The second technological fix that has been proposed is net zero. Net zero means basically we will reach net zero by producing carbon, but having it be absorbed by newly planted forest, trees that absorb carbon from the atmosphere. If you take a plane ride, you may be invited to buy an offset. You may be invited to have trees planted somewhere in possibly Indonesia that will absorb the same amount of carbon that is your proportionate share of the pollution emitted by the plane ride that you're taking. However, even if this is done, this isn't always done honestly. The trees don't always get planted, or they get planted in ways that are not ecologically sustaining. They get planted in essentially factory tree farms, and they may be the kind of trees that use up a lot of energy, that use up a lot of water or other resources. But even if they are planted, and even if they absorb the carbon, this happens over the life of a tree, which may be 20 or 30 or 40 years, whereas your plane ride happens all in one day. Many corporations have been producing pledges that they are going to go to net zero by 2030 or 2050. And these prospects, which are pretty evanescent, pretty unlikely to be fulfilled in the future, but even if they were fulfilled, they are a promise for the future rather than what is going on now. The most frightening technological fix is geoengineering, also known as solar radiation management, which has been proposed to shoot particles into the atmosphere that will block out part of the radiation of the sun. And some people, Elizabeth Kolberg is one of the best environmental journalists around, has written a book which devotes a lot of attention to geoengineering. And while I don't think she's happy about it, she says it's probably going to happen just because it can. However, first of all, the consequences are totally unknown. What would happen if we started blocking out the radiation of the sun? Secondly, we do know that if we do it, it has to go on forever, because the stuff that we shoot into the atmosphere to keep the sun from penetrating into the atmosphere, these things are not permanent. They dissolve, and we would have to keep shooting them into the atmosphere. So this is something that it would also turn the sky, according to Elizabeth Kolberg. It would turn the sky white. Her book is called The White Sky, in recognition of the fact that whatever produces the color of the sky would no longer be active. And so all of these technological fixes are basically ways of telling us that we can do something very specific that will prevent us from having to change our way of life. John Kerry, who is Biden's climate ambassador and who, as a senator, was very active in environmental causes, said a year or two ago, half of the technology that we will need to limit global warming hasn't been invented yet. Well, if you're confident in future inventions, maybe you will accept the idea that we can rely on these technological fixes. I'm not. But the final objection to degrowth is that it's no fun. That is to say, we like our stuff so much that we don't want to lower our consumption patterns. Branko Milanovic, who is an economist at the Graduate Center and former head economist of the World Bank, says, we don't want to live like monks. The idea being that we would have to live like monks. Well, the degrowth argument is, first of all, of course, redistribution, that if we could capture the wealth that is going to the wealthy, it could be apportioned out in ways that would guarantee everybody a reasonable standard of living. And of course, the idea is that, yes, indeed, we can shift down. We can shift our consumption in a way that would be more beneficial to the planet. I was going to talk a bit about the pandemic and what that tells us about possibilities for changing our patterns of energy use and resource use. But I'm going to skip over that because I do want to have at least a couple of minutes for comments and questions. Let me just say that we need to decarbonize, decommodify, democratize, decolonize, and degrow. And finally, I said at the beginning that there are problems with the name of degrowth, in that it suggests shrinkage, when really what it's about is a good life for everyone within planetary limits. So I hope that that's what you will take away from this talk, that that's what degrowth means. It would eventually mean a decrease in gross domestic product, but basically it means we would all be living a better life. And as I also said at the beginning, I hope to persuade you that you all are in favor of degrowth, even if you didn't know it ahead of time. Thank you. So comments, Tom.
Thank you for this very informative presentation. Just a quick comment before my question is that geoengineering platform that I was just reading about recently, it's just funny, it just struck me now. Calvin and I were talking about the matrix before the department meeting, and the problem was that the humans scorched the sky in order to protect themselves from the tyranny of the machines. So
Right.
maybe we'll head in that direction. But my question is this, it's an incredibly interesting platform. I understand it as sort of bringing the principles of socialism into line with modern environmentalism and sort of a better understanding of the earth and a better understanding of holistic character of humanity, and better attention to equity and all kinds of new things. But it ultimately, to me, strikes me as a very well-informed and well-rounded political program. And what these things end up doing are either becoming sort of embraced by a small number of people who create a subculture around these lifestyles and change their personal lifestyles and often form tight-knit communities around the principles involved. Or the other alternative is it becomes a platform for a revolutionary movement, because it's highly unlikely that the principles of degrowth are going to be embraced in today's economic system. So, given how wonderful the platform seems, like what do you see as steps towards future progress? That sort of pragmatic rather, political organizing question. How do you see that going?
Well, I have two answers to that. One is one of basically despair, because we don't really have time, given the possibility of warming, we don't really have time for the kind of gradual change that might, some of the policy steps that I outlined that might bring some of them about. And I have to say, I fluctuate between despair and thinking that, well, we have to go plugging ahead anyway. But that, on the latter point, there are certainly things that have happened that offer possibilities for optimism. If you look at the presidential campaigns of the last two elections, particularly the Bernie Sanders campaign, but also Elizabeth Warren, the possible discussions have at least expanded. It's possible to talk about Medicare for all today, as it wasn't, 10 years ago. It is within the realm of possibility, and it's possible to conceive that steps in that direction might be taken. I think it is possible to talk about improvements in some of the public policies, transportation, job guarantees, and so forth. And this I left out because I didn't talk about the pandemic, but if we look at what was done in the pandemic, we saw a lot of things happen that, that would have seemed inconceivable and were done, have since been revoked perhaps, but at least for a time we learned that the government could step in and provide family allowances that would decrease the poverty among children in the country by, I don't remember the figures, but 10% or 20%, cut it in half down to less than 10%. And if we could reinstitute some of those things. Now, I don't want there to be any confusion between degrowth and the economic problems that we suffered because of the pandemic. I don't want people to think that, well, degrowth means that we're going to be, have 20% unemployment and people, subject to various kinds of controls because of the health situation itself. Degrowth means you plan to shrink, you plan to reduce the kinds of things that have negative effects on the population, and we'd like to see that that continued. But I guess I have to say, I'm not totally embarrassed to be presenting a program that I know is impractical, because somebody has to do it.
Right, it's not a criticism, it's not a criticism.
No, I know, but I just do, it's possible to say, you're out in totally out in left field and it's never going to happen. Well, maybe that's true, but as I say, some people have to offer the alternative that we believe we should be pursuing. Mark.
Yeah, and I don't want to be a wet blanket and ask those kinds of questions either, because I like the optimistic proposals. But here's a wet blanket question. No, here's actually a factual question, I suppose, which is maybe my first one is there a within the degrowth movement, is there
You can call it a movement, yeah.
Population growth or population? I don't think you mentioned that. And my second question is, well, I'll ask it.
I would say on population, the tendency among people who argue for degrowth is to say that really, if you look at the environmental problems that are the result of excess resource use, excess production, excess energy use, you find that the damage that's done is has much more to do with inequality and has much more to do with the distribution of riches. If you think about the environmental toll of a middle-class child born in Manhattan compared to the environmental toll of an average child born in Rwanda, the one in Manhattan is, doing a lot. This kid who's not responsible for what is done in his or her name is doing a lot more harm than the one in Rwanda. Population trends, it's been suggested that the population increase is definitely declining, and that the population will probably continue to increase in the century till sometime before reaching 10 billion people, and then they will start absolute declines. Now, 10 billion is still a lot, but the argument is definitely that more has to be done with the structure of the economy than concern about population growth. Population changes are due to changes in women's choices on the basis of greater women's education, and that this is basically an irreversible trend that is going to continue. So this could also be taken as a criticism that they're not sufficiently attentive to the population issue, but I don't think it's a totally telling objection.
In the chat, there's a question.
Okay. Yeah, Karsten, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so I put something in the chat. I'll read it, but then continue a little bit. So while I agree that degrowth would certainly would imply not living like monks, it would involve, at least for some of us, a very different orientation towards consuming. And since many people in advanced industrial countries are addicted to a lifestyle based on having many goods, what do you propose as a way of addressing this? I don't think you can simply tell people that the consumer treadmill is not healthy. People have been saying that for years, and that doesn't seem to be sufficient. It does seem that you're going to have to give people a very different orientation to what their life is like and what a good life is and what well-being is. And it's not so easy to get people to simply go from the orientation that they have now, which is the orientation of having a lot of goods, to an orientation which values other things. So what would you propose on a large scale to get people off that consumer treadmill?
So it does require a major value change, which is not going to happen automatically, but there are signs that as some of the kinds of policies that I've talked about are adopted, that does lead to changes in consumer orientation that we can see by going back to the comparisons between wealthy societies of greater equality and lesser equality. In societies of greater equality, conspicuous consumption is not nearly as great a phenomenon. There are, compare the use of bicycles in Denmark or Sweden to the United States. Compare the size of houses that people live in. There is a lot of limitation of what I see as excessive consumption, that people do not feel the need to, in effect, to show off. There's also a lot of, in this country, there's a lot of defensive consumption. We consume not because we're addicted, individuals are addicted, not because individuals feel that they have to have all these goods and show off, but because the system works in such a way as to demand it of us. And the best example of this is the real estate market. If you look at the fact that in New York City, we have new buildings going up in which condominiums cost $150 million. Most of us, probably nobody on this call can afford a $150 million condo. If you can. But this, and probably most of us can't afford $5 million condos either. But the $150 million condo sucks up the prices of the lower cost places, and it cascades all the way down through the real estate market to the, $4,000 rental for a studio. And then below that to the homeless person on the street who can't find an apartment that they can live in. So that some, these are changes that would perhaps not, it's hard to say that these would solve the problem, but they would move us in the direction of solving that problem.
Just for the sake of time, I know your hand was up. I see Ben's and then Jeff's, so we can go quick and then lightning round.
Okay.
Answers, just because of time.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm on you.
When you spoke about the economy and the service of needs, not profit, you specified that you were speaking about the countries in the Northern Hemisphere. My question is, how do we prevent corporations from the Northern Hemisphere from profiting from an economy of for the service of needs that would continue in the Southern Hemisphere?
Well, of course, a large part of that is due to the excessive consumption in the Northern Hemisphere. If our demand shrunk, then the burden on those countries would also shrink, and they could use the resources that they now put into producing, mass consumer goods for export. They could put those resources into improving the status of their population. Clearly, this has the same objections of requiring a political revolution before it could happen, but at least the material possibilities are there.
Ben, next.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, for example, with this idea of degrowth, like New York City right now is piloting a compost program. Some neighborhoods are using this more than others are, where it's offered. And just like recycling, which is arguably not a great program in itself, but I'm just using that as an example of something that takes a cultural shift, which was ultimately mandated by the state. So degrowth, like the idea is this cultural shift. Now, what that means exactly, I don't know, but it's essentially ushering people into a new level of consciousness. And this isn't going to happen when corporations are running everything because they want us to consume. So I think the question is really, how do we make this cultural shift? How do we ask what people are willing to give up? And I don't mean that it's a negative thing, and to see what really matters. And I think this is just going to take a massive undertaking, both socially, psychologically, et cetera. I watched the Super Bowl the other night, and it was like an absolute assault on my senses. I haven't watched television with commercials in such a long time. And I was like, wow, this is unbelievable how this is still perpetuated. And I think still a lot of people fall in line with this sort of thinking of buy this, get this, like the military propaganda here, that, America, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, my point is it's like that, to me, the Super Bowl was a representation of this, like this culture that is so powerful, and we need to figure out how to quash that and spread it out, and make these social and psychological changes, for society. So thanks.
Go ahead, Ken.
This is a really terrific paper. I'm so glad that I heard it. And I wish I had it when I taught my environmental policy class a year ago. So hats off for the paper. You used the word despair at the end. And I must say, all of our suggestions here in the discussion are sort of the social democratic variety. But when the world goes through major changes, as it did with the advance of industrialization in the early 20th, that is began much earlier, but the impact in the early 20th century, and we wound up with Nazism and fascism in World War II. And now we're winding up with a wild populism with the transition to the computer age. Degrowth would be another brand new shift, and there are scary things to think about. So I just thought I'd bring that up. But again, hats off, terrific paper.
Well, to both of you, I guess I have to say you're right. These are problems to which I don't have an answer. There is this would require a huge cultural shift, and it certainly requires at least 2 tracks, or I would say 3 tracks. It requires the cultural shift. It requires policy at the national level, and it also requires local implementation, not to speak of international. Maybe I guess there are really 4 tracks there. How do we move on all of these tracks at once? And how do we make sure, how do we produce the changes fast enough to make the difference that is needed to be made? I must admit, as I already did, I don't entirely have an answer to that, but I hope that we could see people working in various dimensions at various levels, and that some of these changes will start to come about.
All right, very last question to Jeff.
It's on the same lines. Yeah, thinking about economies of cities. I was teaching the leisure, recreation, and sports class, and towards the end we did a section on basic income. And one of the sections, and I want to get your opinion on this. During the pandemic, there were localities in Korea that they had these like local basic income bucks, and you have to spend them locally on local goods and services.
Mhm.
And then, so it was culturally promoted, it was implemented locally, and they also were able to do studies, and they found that many younger people were much more engaged and ready to spend these kind of local bucks. Do you see any possibility for this income in these kind of local programs?
Like large enough.
Oh, I guess I'm still on because you're not remote.
I'm not there.
Right, yeah. Well, this is a huge subject. There is an affinity between degrowth scholarship and what is referred to as the popular control of money. They overlap. They're not exactly the same thing. I would say most advocates of degrowth see this as a possibility, and one which would, if you had a universal basic income distributed essentially in the form of vouchers that can only be used for basic needs, that would provide for everybody's basic needs. It would prevent inflation because you would have no reason to save the money and try to accumulate and then build large fortunes from it. And obviously one of the problems with major government spending programs as proposed is the danger of inflation. This would offer some insurance against it. I don't know about the Korean example. I do know that there are cases, Ithaca, New York, for example, has a local currency. I don't really know how much it's been studied or what effect it has, but it's certainly an interesting theoretical possibility. And as I say, it's not part of degrowth scholarship, but it's something that a whole lot of degrowth scholars have looked at, and there's a strong affinity between the two prospects. Mhm.
All right, well, thank you, Jack. Thank you all for online. And sorry
Thank
for the
everybody. Special hand to our techie, Eric, who
Work under pressure today.
right, worked under pressure. Thanks, everybody.